I'm gonna use your
We're so
podcast right now. Okay?
this
Oh yeah.
this whole RONNEFALK thing got us
All
completely
flustered.
disorganized.
Anyway, so
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm gonna use your podcast because I have to sell some. I have to pay some bills. This week is the last week that you can sign up to the Invisible Speed online course. If you get the full course, you will also get to speak with David Ronnefalk because he's going to be one of the teachers. It's Ronnefalk, Robert Battier, Carl McBride, and Cole Ogden. Those 4 pros, and then one Joe, me. And we're going to teach you for 1 month straight all the stuff that's in the course. It happens on Discord,
That's
so
right.
live calls and all that stuff. So it's going to be well worth the money. So if you sign up this week and buy the full course, you're in. So make
Does
sure
RONNEFALK give setup advice to the Mayako car?
all cars. But
try. Good one, Max. Good
he
one.
hasn't
Good
driven
one.
the Mayako car, so he doesn't really
Good
know.
one, Max. You almost got him. You almost got him. I saw it.
He had
I
to
saw the
think. He
hesitation.
had to think.
But
He did.
hey,
He did.
this is the intro for a YouTube video. So I'm gonna give out a free sample of the course now. Which video should I show? I was thinking I would show the piston video.
You're gonna show a course now, video now.
Yeah, pretend this is my YouTube channel, not your podcast. I'm hijacking this for a few minutes.
Oh, okay.
I'm using this as my intro.
I haven't seen the piston video, so
So the piston video is
Sure, go
good,
ahead.
trust me. We go science mode, deep science mode in it.
Is this
Okay.
gonna be long?
No, so we're done now. So now, everyone, you're going to see the piston video from the course. And after that, go on invisiblespeed.net and buy the course so I can pay Lefty his extremely high salary.
Or maybe you're saving that for RONNEFALK.
Yeah, actually, that's a good
Yeah,
one. Invisible Speed Science Ronnefalk. He can run any chassis and just provide feedback for the course. You didn't think about that, did you?
he did. He did. Before you joined, he said that. He said that he was talking
Oh,
to
you did?
RONNEFALK, and RONNEFALK.
that.
Think outside
just-
of the box, Keenan. Okay, anyway.
Yeah,
here we go.
well, you know, I when something clicked, when somebody said something, I was like, ooh, that's possible. So
It's possible. Okay, now pistons. Okay, now we get to the mystery part of our shocks, the pistons. This is the most understood. This is the most mysterious and misunderstood part of setting up your car. And my goal right now is to demystify this because it's not a massive mystery. It's actually not that complicated. I'm going to prove it to you right now. Okay? At least it's not that complicated to understand what's going on. Not telling you I know what piston you should run on any track. No, but at least you'll know what's happening. Okay, here we go. So, we know that what we are adjusting is how the damping works at low versus high speed. When I say low speed, I'm talking about piston speed by the way, not the speed of the car on the track. The speed that's relevant is the speed of the piston. How fast is the piston moving in the body? Is it moving slowly or is it moving fast? So low speed damping versus high speed damping. Speed of the piston, that's relevant. Low speed damping refers to the piston movements when the car is accelerating, for example, or braking, or turning and rolling in a corner. So the piston movements are slow. As the car corners and the car rolls onto the outside suspension, the outside shocks compress and the piston moves up in the body. And the inside shocks extend and the piston moves down in the body. That's all low speed damping. High speed damping would be when you hit a bump on the track at really high speed and the suspension needs to deflect really fast. Or when you land off a jump, for example. That's high speed damping. Something maybe overlooked by many is damping slows down the speed of the piston. So actually, even those moments of high speed damping, they become low speed damping at some point, right? Because the piston is slowing down. But that's what they are doing with full size racing. For RC, our shocks are wrong, you know. Shocks shouldn't lock up like they do for us. That's how we adjust them. No one else in the whole world does this, I think. Only RC. In the real world, they adjust them in different ways to where they don't lock up, and they just adjust high speed and low speed damping separately. We don't have that in our shocks yet. But yeah, we need to. Anyway, pistons, as they are working today, what we are doing is we are adjusting how that pack occurs, at what speed, and how aggressively. That's really what we are adjusting. So we are adjusting the feel between our low speed damping and our high speed damping, which is basically pack, so the shock locking up. That's what we are doing. To understand what's happening inside the shock for this to happen, we need to understand the very basic fluid dynamics. Okay, let's take a look here. There's something called the no-slip condition or no-slip boundary. And that states that the velocity of a liquid at a surface, so this could be a cross-section of a piston and a hole in the piston, and the oil is moving through the hole. The velocity of the oil at the surface of the piston, at the surface of the hole, is the same as that of the piston. So it would be 0 here. And then in the middle of the hole, that will be the highest velocity of the oil. So there's a difference between the 0 at the surface and the velocity of the oil in the middle. And this causes the oil to shear. So it's like the oil is being torn through that hole, right? Because some of the oil is standing still, and then here in the middle it's traveling at the highest speed. So there's a rate of change here between 0 and the maximum velocity of the oil. And the rate of change in velocity, the higher that is, the higher the shear rate of the oil. The more friction there is, the more resistance to movement there is. So if you have a smaller hole in a piston and you try to move the piston through the oil at the same speed, the rate of change of velocity will be higher. The friction will also be higher then. If you have a larger hole, the rate of change of velocity will be lower. So the shear rate will also be lower. So less friction. So larger holes in the piston will pack up later at a higher speed. Smaller holes will pack up earlier at a lower speed. And to demonstrate this a bit better, because I can just tell you that, okay, the velocity here at the surface is 0, in the middle it's the highest, and why would you believe me, right? Well, that's why I prepared some proof. So let's look at this video here. In this video, they are going to let out some dye into this liquid, which is flowing. You can see that the liquid is flowing when the dye starts coming out. And look what happens here. So here you can see that the dye is coming out and it's flowing. But the dye that was left on the surface isn't moving. You can see that the liquid is moving clearly. The dye is moving, but not on the surface. And if you then brush it off the surface, it moves along with the liquid. So that's just to prove to you that this is actually real. It's not some weird theory. It's actually happening in reality. Now let's look at some pistons that we like to use and try and understand what the difference is in theory and what we feel on the track. So here I've prepared this spreadsheet for you, and there are a bunch of different pistons here, but let's focus on these. The 5-hole one, and then this 8-hole one, for example. Okay, so 5 holes of 1.5 millimeter size, the piston hole area is 8.83. 8 holes of 1.2 millimeter size, piston hole area is 9.04. Okay, so there's slightly more hole area in the 8-hole piston than the 5-hole piston. Now, the hole area will determine to a great extent the thickness of the shock oil you need to run so that you have the right feel. Now, when I say feel, I mean the feel that the suspension has when you try it in the pits. You just move the suspension up and down and you can sense that, okay, this is in the right range, or this is way too soft, this is way too hard. Okay, so to get a similar feel, when you have more piston hole area, you will need thicker oil. So just looking at the piston hole area, you would think that, okay, so the 8-hole is probably a softer piston than the 5-hole one because it has more hole area. So I'm going to have to run, maybe going to have to run thicker oils. Actually, on this list, you can see I tend to run the same shock oils in the 1.5s or the 1.2s. Okay, then we move on. Then we look at the piston hole circumference. And then we see, whoa, well, there's a big difference here. With the 5-hole one, you have 23.55 millimeters. And with the 8-hole one, you have 30.14. So you have a lot more hole circumference. So you have a lot more wall surface area that the oil is traveling through in the 8-hole piston. Here I've also calculated an area to circumference ratio just to give me an idea of where we are, what's going on. So 38% and 30%. You can see there's a quite big difference there also. So the difference between these pistons isn't the amount of hole area. That's not the main difference. The main difference is how much piston hole circumference there is. And because the pistons are equally thick, how much wall area there is that the oil needs to pass by. The more wall area there is, the more friction there is, which means that the piston has more pack. So just by looking at these numbers, we can tell that the 8-hole piston will have more pack than the 5-hole piston. So even if the feel on the table is the same, even if we end up running the same viscosity shock oil, on the track, the 8-hole piston will have more pack than the 5-hole piston. And that's because of this number here, 30 versus 23. The piston hole circumference, the amount of wall surface that the oil has to pass by, is larger on the 8-hole piston. So the larger this number is, the more pack that piston will have. The larger this number is, the softer feel the suspension will have, low speed. So this is sort of a very basic way of adjusting your low speed versus high speed on our shocks. The more piston hole area you have, the softer the feel of the suspension will be, the calmer the car will be. But the more wall area, the more pack the suspension will have. It's not quite that simple, but it will give you a sort of idea to go by. So when would you like to run the 5-hole piston, and when would you like to run the 8-hole piston? So the important thing to notice is that with a 5-hole piston, since you don't have that much pack, you can get away with running a thicker shock oil. So you can make the suspension more firm. You can run a harder spring, you can run harder shock oil, you can make the movements of the car more stable and slow. So if you're on a very high grip track, you can make the car very calm with this suspension, yet still have a suitable amount of pack. So when you land jumps, when you hit bumps on the track, the suspension will still handle and absorb those impacts. You won't have too much pack, even though the suspension is very hard and firm. So on very high grip tracks or difficult tracks where you need to calm the car down, it can even be loose tracks, but just you want the car to be more calm and stable. You would run a piston with fewer larger holes. Then an 8-hole piston, when would you want to run that? Well, if you are on a very loose track, for example, you can make yours, or also not just loose, let's say a very uneven surface, not necessarily big bumps, just sort of a rough terrain, sort of rocky or tractor marks, footprints, just an uneven racing surface, and especially if it's uneven and loose, a bit dusty at the same time. Well, you run an 8-hole piston. What you can do then is you can set your suspension a bit softer. So you run a bit thinner shock oil, maybe even a softer spring to allow the car to roll more. And then you still have enough pack to where when you hit a bump at speed or you land a jump, the suspension will still pack up enough. So of course there's some crossover between this, but this is a good general rule to have in mind and understand that if you want your car to be calm and stable, run fewer larger holes. If you want the car to be more responsive and have a bit more grip, then run more smaller holes. That's the basic idea. So fewer big holes, it makes it possible to set the suspension up firmer with a harder spring and thicker oil while still having a suitable amount of pack. More smaller holes makes it possible to set the suspension softer while still having a suitable amount of pack. So this is the basic idea of how the pistons work in our shocks and how we adjust them. Now, when we move on then and we start fine-tuning this idea, we move beyond just the fact that we have a certain amount of holes and a certain size of holes. We start mixing different hole sizes. Well, what are we doing there? Well, what we are doing is we can add piston hole area by adding some small holes so that the low speed damping is softer and more plush. But that small hole, the friction in that hole will be so high that as the speed increases, the oil won't be able to flow through it. So if we have a very small hole like 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter, it will mainly soften the piston up at lower speeds. And then at higher speeds, the car will still have good pack. So that's one thing you can do. Also, when you mix, let's say, a split, like you have 3 1.3s, 3 1.4s, versus just having 6 1.35s or something. Like, I didn't do the math right now, but you get the idea. Like, you end up with the same hole area with 2 different size holes. What could be different then is the amount of piston hole circumference. So you are keeping the same or very similar low speed damping, but changing how the pack comes in, because you are staggering the hole sizes in some way. And we also go even beyond that. We have different piston shapes. We have flat pistons and different thickness of flat pistons. So a thicker piston, well, now we understand what's going on. So we know a thicker piston will have more pack. It will be more aggressive because there'll be more area, piston hole wall area, to cause friction and shear in the oil. So a thicker piston will have more pack. At low speeds, the effect of the thicker piston won't be that noticeable. So at low speeds, the oil will still flow through those piston holes. But at higher speeds, you'll have more friction. So thicker piston, longer holes, more pack. Thinner piston, shorter holes, less pack. The conical piston, the shape of it, that also affects how the oil passes past the piston and also into the hole. So the cone shape will move easier through the oil. So the side of the taper, that will be faster. But also because, imagine you have a straight hole through a piston and then a taper. That whole opening will be larger. So on the side of the taper on the piston, the entry to the hole is larger. So it's easier for the oil to get in there. So the side with the taper is faster. Normally people run it so that's on the rebound side, so the underside of the piston. So that means that compression of the piston, when it the suspension moves up, the suspension compresses, that will be slower, and the rebound with the tapered side, that will be a bit faster. That's what people are trying to do there with the taper. Now, I don't really agree with that much because, well, we'll get into that later. You can also run the flat side down and taper up, and that's going to be the opposite, where you have slightly faster compression and then slower rebound. Why would you do that? Well, you would do that on a very smooth track where you don't have bumps, because the car would be worse in bumps, but you'll have more corner speed. So it's something worth trying. My personal opinion is that when you make the rebound faster, that it makes the car more nervous. And I don't want my car to be more nervous. Yes, I may have a bit more grip, but it's also nervous. I want my car to be stable. So if anything, I would run the flat side down and cone shape up. Now, an extreme example of this is the MIP pistons, which are quite popular now. They have a valve on top of the piston, so it blocks some holes for compression, and then it opens up and allows for more oil flow on rebound. So it makes the rebound fast. I haven't had luck with this piston, to be honest. I think on some cars like the Mugen, maybe it can be really good, because maybe the Mugen is naturally not so springy or responsive. I don't know. I don't drive a Mugen. But on my cars that I've tried this on, it just makes the car too responsive and nervous feeling. And it feels like it wants to jump up and pop up over everything. And I don't like that feeling. So I don't like to run those. But I have seen drivers have a lot of success with those, especially on really rough tracks. So if you're loose track, rough track, those kind of pistons that have a faster rebound, they can give you more traction. They can also help you handle bumps better if you have the right setup. Then we also have a type of piston that I actually do like a lot, and that's a conical shaped piston with angled holes. Now, the thing about the angled holes is that they actually make the length of the hole longer. So there's more wall surface again to cause friction. And I'm the wrong kind of engineer to answer this question, but I just have a hunch that the fact that the oil flow can't be straight, that it has to turn into that hole in the piston and then turn again as it comes out. I don't know. I just have a feeling that the fact that the oil flow has corners to it could affect the friction also. So that piston with the angled holes, I like it because you can set the suspension to be very soft and plush, yet it still has enough pack. So it's a really fast piston, especially if you are running on a sort of medium to loose track, relatively smooth. That piston is really fast. So look out for that one. I know Ultimate Racing sells 7 and 8 hole versions where it's flat on one side, conical on the other, and the holes are angled. So there you go. A lot of information about pistons, but I hope you now understand the basic concept, the reason for pistons working the way they do. In the case studies section, we're going to go over this information again, but as it applies to a track or a problem with the car that you want to solve. So by watching the videos in this section and also the ones in the case studies section, I'm sure you'll grasp all of these different things. So the springs, damping, pistons, shock oils, all of this stuff. Don't worry, you'll get it. Let's move on.